Good luck. It's a nice thing that people say. You have a test coming up. Your friend tells you, good luck. These are important clients. This is a big account. And your boss tells you before the meeting, good luck. It's a biopsy. The results have come back. Before you go in, the nurse smiles and says, hey, good luck. And really, that's the best the world can do. They don't know whether what's going to happen is going to be good for you or bad for you. Life is full of suffering and pleasure. Which will be, they don't know. But as Christians, we can do better than, I hope it works out well for you. As Christians, we know God's plan and we know God's providence. And it's God's providence that makes the difference. God's providence is God's invisible working through natural processes. It can only be seen if you believe God already, whereas God's miracle is obvious to everyone. One passage that talks about God's providence and his plan of salvation is Romans 8:28, and through verse 30. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those whom he predestined, he also called. Those whom he called, he also justified. Those whom he justified, he also glorified. The first three words are something we often omit, and we know. Everything that is said here is something that we already know. And how do we know it? We get a clue from the use of that phrase in the book of Romans. 6 times we're told we know something. Romans chapter 2, verse 22, we know that the judgment of God falls on sinners. Romans 3:19 and 7:14, we know something about the law. Romans 8:22, we know that the whole creation groaned in anticipation for the new creation. And in Romans 8:28, we know that all things work together for good. In every case, what we know because of the Bible. We know God's judgments because God tells us about his standards. We know God's standards because he's given us his law. Because we know God's law, we know it's against sinners. Because we know what sin did at the Garden of Eden, we know that the world isn't the way it's supposed to be. And because we know what God said at the Garden of Eden, we also know that someday God will restore creation to its pristine form. And so we know that all things work together for good because we know God's providence. God's plans is an integral part of his providence. We have to understand God's plan of salvation to understand how this is supposed to work. So to understand God's providence, to understand God's plan, you can think of Romans 8:28-30 in 3 categories. We've got the what of God's providence, then we got the who of God's providence, and then we've got the how of God's providence. Let's first look at the what of God's providence. The first thing we know is that all things work together for good. Do you enjoy good health today? Perhaps you're an avid runner, or you play sports. Or maybe you're just doing better than most people your age. That is something to be thankful for, but not every Christian has good health. I know a man who's in his 20s, and he's a brilliant man. In fact, he's smart enough, he's working on his PhD. But he also has cerebral palsy. He is completely unable to even dress himself. And since cerebral palsy has no cure, this is something he will deal with for the rest of his life. if the good things that God gives is only health, he missed out. We live in a wealthy country where few of us are so poor that we actually don't have enough to eat or a roof over our heads. So whether you're wealthy or not, you probably get enough to eat. But in some parts of the world, that is not the case. My sister works in Chad, one of the poorest countries in the world, and there, many people, even Christians, have wants lacking in food or medical care or sanitation. If meeting all of our needs was all that God meant by good, then these people miss out. The all things that work together are all things. And so to make them good, it has to be our ultimate good. That ultimate good has to be enough to outweigh the inevitable sufferings that happen in this present time. And in fact, that's what Paul already said in verse 18. Romans 8:18 says, "And I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed in us." It's not so much only that the glory counterbalances the suffering. It's so much greater than the suffering. They're not even worth putting together and comparing. The poor Christian today can still sing, "I've got a mansion just over the hilltop." The Christian bound to a wheelchair can still say that he will run someday and not be weary. He will walk and not faint. But it's more than that God uses good in a way that counterbalances the suffering. He actually uses the suffering itself for our good. James 1:2-4. "My brothers, count it all joy when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Trials produce good character when we respond to them properly. And this good character doesn't just help us in this life, it also helps to prepare us for the perfect life someday when Jesus returns. Heaven doesn't just make everything better. It's that patchwork of suffering and blessing that fits together, works together, and cooperates to produce the ultimate good in our lives. Our lives are a half-finished cross-stitch, which we see from the back. It's all a mess, lines going every which way, and it doesn't make any sense. But someday it'll be finished and we'll see it from the front. Not only do we know that all things work together for good, but that promise is not for everyone. There's a limit. All things work together for good only for those who love God. There is no promise that everything will work together for good for non-Christians. This is because ultimate good can only be enjoyed by those who can experience salvation. God does give some good, even to those in the world. Matthew 5:45. "For God makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust." But there's always going to be some remainder. Perhaps the suffering ends in death, and now what happens? Perhaps the trial actually overwhelms them and destroys their life because they don't respond properly. Perhaps they sin and never repent, and so it doesn't turn out for their good. But for Christians, God will ultimately make it all work for good. And indeed, for those who love God, Though that really is only Christians. For while others might claim to love God, only Christians can truly love him. Jesus told some Jews who said they believed him. He told them, if God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. John 8:42. That's the human side of our salvation. The divine side is God's purpose. Those who love God are also called those who are called according to God's purpose. It is God's purposes that makes everything work together for good. They don't just automatically work together for good. They only work because God planned that they would, and somehow will make it all fit in the end. So to understand God's providence, we have to understand his purposes. And to understand his purposes, we have to understand his chain of salvation. That's the how of God's providence. The third thing we know is that all things work together for good because God has chosen to save us and glorify us. Look at verse 29. This chain of God's plan of salvation begins with God's foreknowledge for those whom he foreknew. Now, if you take that word apart to foreknow or know before, it would simply indicate that God knows something in advance. So God sees us in advance. But that doesn't make sense. God knows in advance everyone who will ever exist, and he's known it since the dawn of time. There is nothing that God does not know. And yet this kind of foreknowledge is not for everyone, because those whom God foreknew are also predestined to be conformed to God's image. So this kind of foreknowledge has to be something that isn't true for those that do not ever get saved. We get a clue by looking a bit more carefully at that phrase itself. It says that God foreknew those people. God, those whom he foreknew, not that he foreknew what they would do or believe, but that he foreknew them. Let me explain. This is a relational kind of knowing. If you study a subject, maybe you study math, you learn formulas. If you study history, you learn events. If you study science, you learn about the scientific method and you test stuff. In all cases, these are facts. You just simply learn the facts, and once you learn, grasp, understand the facts, you know the subject. But knowing people is not quite like that. Imagine that you want to get to know someone. So you find their profile on social media and you read all about them. Perhaps you even see them, but you don't talk to them. Now, if you start following them home, you've crossed the line from a little weird, and now you're a full-on stalker. But obviously, all of that doesn't mean you know them. To actually know them as people, you have to talk to them, for them to share their life with you, and you to share your life with them. That's relational knowing. And God describes knowing in this way in Amos chapter 3, verse 2. He says, "You, Israel, you only have I known of all the families of the earth." Obviously, God knows the identity of all people groups everywhere in the world. But he had, in the Old Testament, only established a relationship with Israel. So when God foreknows the Christian, it's God looks down through history and sees that person and decides he's going to have a relationship with them. He already knew them as people from the dawn of time. Now, in order for God to actually have a relationship with people, God must act. That's why the second link in this chain of God's plan is predestination. Those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. This means that God decided who they would be in advance. Now, this decision doesn't override their free will. God can act in such a way that he can convince them to love him rather than force them. But God did not just choose to save you. He chose to conform you to the image of Christ. In this life, God is molding your character to be more like him. 2 Corinthians 3:18, and we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed to the same image from one degree of glory to another. But someday we will be perfectly like him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be is not yet appeared, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. 1 John 3:2. So God is going to conform us to his image. He is doing it now, bit by bit, over time, and at the end, when we see him, he will do it all at once as well. God predestined us to the end of the process, not the beginning of the process. But why would God do this? The second clause in this verse says that God predestined us so that he, Jesus, might be the firstborn among many brothers. Now, in the ancient world, to be a firstborn is to carry privileges compared to your brothers. The oldest inherits a double portion of the inheritance. In addition, the oldest is expected to lead. Jesus is the firstborn, not only in time, because he is the firstborn of the dead. Colossians 1:18, Jesus is the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning, the firstborn of the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. He is the firstborn in the sense that he's the first one to rise from the dead with a glorified body. And he's the firstborn in preeminence in the sense that he is to be first. But he is not to be alone. Jesus is not to be in a separate category from us. Instead, we are to be considered his brothers. We are to become so like Christ, both in body and in the way we think, that we can be considered his brothers and sisters. Now, in this link of salvation, God foreknows people by having a relationship with them. He predestines them to the end of salvation to be conformed to Christ's image. In the third link of the chain, those whom he predestined, he also called. Now, the Bible uses call in two ways. Sometimes it describes a call to salvation in a general way as applying to everyone. Jesus said in Matthew 22:14, "For many are called, few are chosen." And in this sense, not everyone accepts the call. But in other places, like this verse here, the call is always effective, because everyone that is predestined is also called, and everyone that is called is also justified. So in this case, this is the offer of salvation that you actually accept. What it looks like is the time you actually believed the gospel and accepted it for yourself. Now, most people don't accept the gospel the very first time they hear it. But when you did accept the gospel, that is God's call. That is his offer of salvation to you. The fourth link in the chain is that everyone whom God has called is also justified. Now, in the book of Romans, Paul has already taken a lot of space to explain what he means by being justified. If we use the word normally in an average sentence, not a theological one, we mean that someone is proven right. We might say he tried to justify his behavior by saying he was treated unfairly by his boss. So to be really justified this way, you actually have to be right. But that doesn't work. In the eyes of God, we are all sinners. Romans 8:23. So we need another way of being justified. And this way of being justified is to be declared right because the penalty is paid, not because you have not committed the crime. There is no perfect analogy between God's justification and our justice system, because no justice system can function the way God's salvation does and still work. The closest thing in our justice system is someone who has been declared guilty, but his sentence is commuted to time already served. That's not a perfect illustration because he's not considered innocent and he still has been punished to a degree, whereas the Christian has no more condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, Romans 8:1. But it means that Jesus paid the penalty already, so we are declared to be right before God because by faith we have received God's righteousness. Jesus Christ offers you a chance to be justified through his blood. He took the penalty for the sins you deserve so that all your sins can be forgiven always and forever. This brings us to the final link in the chain. Everyone whom God justified, he also glorified. Notice that all along the link between the first and last step is unbreakable. Everyone that God foreknew, he also predestined. Everyone that God predestined, he also called. Everyone that God called, he also justified. And now everyone he justified, he also glorified. But wait a minute. How can he say we've already been glorified? It's in the past tense. And yet our glorification is still future, something Paul has already said in this chapter. Romans 8:18, the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed in us. Paul says in Colossians 3:4, when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will appear with him in glory. We haven't been glorified yet. So how can Paul use the past tense? Everyone who is justified has been glorified already. Sometimes there's the prophetic past where a prophet or an apostle will describe something future as if it's already happened to tell us that it is so certain that it might as well have already happened. Your salvation is totally secure. It is just as if you've already been glorified. It is just as much your possession as if you had it now. And because from beginning to end, it is God who performed the salvation. It's God who foreknew. It's God who predestined. It's God who called. It's God who justified. And it's God who glorified. That's what makes it secure. It is not on the basis of your works. And that is why we can have confidence. We know that God's providence will somehow make this patchwork of suffering and blessing to somehow fit together for our ultimate good. God will, of course, eventually change your body and to be like Jesus' body. You will be like him, for you will see him as he is someday. There will be a sudden change, but it's not just that God suddenly will make everything better. It's that God is right now preparing you for that glorious future. God saw every believer from the beginning and wanted to have a relationship with them, which is why he is in the process of molding you into Christ's image. Whatever happens in our life, it will always lead to good in the end. God decided to do it that way long ago. This truth can be a comfort for us in hard times. Good luck? Well, if someone says that to you and they're just wishing you well, you can thank them. But there's no such thing. God's providence is what is key. And that means that for Christians, we know that God will work everything out in the end, even though we can't always explain why it works out in the end. This is a truth that we should use to help alter our view, our perspective of trials. Now, if someone is suffering, if they themselves are currently in pain and hurting, perhaps this verse isn't the best one to use. It's very true. But when someone is hurting, the thing to do is to comfort them, to help them. Now, this verse is to use to change your perspective once the grieving is over, so that you can understand that somehow it will all fit. It will be a strength in your life to give you courage in the dark times. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to God's purpose.